I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, welcome everybody.
Our first guest today is Delinda Hanley of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, a magazine that focuses on news and analysis from and about the Middle East and U.S. policy in that region. Unlike mainstream American publications like the New York Times or Washington Post, the report doesn't take a default pro-Israel stance in their coverage of Middle East affairs. We'll speak to Ms. Hanley about how their coverage of the genocide in Gaza differs from their commercial media's coverage and why that's so important. And specifically, we'll hear the story of an undertaker in Gaza named Abu Jawad, who since October 7th has had to bury hundreds of Gazans in mass graves, many of them children. In the second half of the program, we welcome back friend of the show, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who has some very strong feelings about how, quote, the Pentagon runs America, unquote. We'll speak to him about both the Middle East and Ukraine and the true state of the United States military. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our indomitable corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's get an alternative perspective on reporting on the war in Gaza. David?
Delinda Hanley is news editor and executive director of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. She writes extensively for the magazine on an array of topics, and her stories have also been published in the Arab News, Saudi Aramco World, the Minaret, Islamic Horizons, and other U.S. magazines, including the Jewish Spectator. She has written extensively on Palestine, Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Libya, the emergence of the Muslim voice in Arab politics, and fairness in the mainstream American media. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Delinda Hanley.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome, Delinda. You've been at this for almost 30 years as an editor and publisher of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. It comes out 7 times a year. And in a recent issue in May, there is a horrific article, a eyewitness narrative of a Undertaker in Gaza and what he's been doing since October 8th, which we want to discuss more because it relates critically to the massively undercounted death and injury toll in Gaza. And if they don't count the dead and the injured with some reasonable estimates and allow U.S. and other Western reporters in, which Israel's prohibited for years, including Israeli reporters can't get in, freely report in Gaza, then the intensity of the diplomatic, political, and civic pressure for a permanent ceasefire and full entry of immediate humanitarian aid, food, medicine, water, other necessities, will not be at the level it should be. But before we get into that, Delinda, our listeners might want to know how the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs got underway.
Okay. Well, in 1982, 3 diplomats decided to get together after they all retired in 1980. Edward Henderson was a British diplomat. Andy Kilgore was a U.S. ambassador to Qatar, and my dad, Richard Curtis, was a chief inspector of the U.S. Information Agency. And they all retired, and they said, we have spent our careers telling the Middle East about the U.S. and U.K. It's time to inform Americans about the Middle East. And so they started this magazine, and it started from a newsletter, and it's grown to a 76-page magazine, published 7 times a year. It's a labor of love. And we have lots of challenges I can talk about later, but we are happy to give anyone a sample copy, and we know they'll get hooked and subscribe for $29 a year. And they just send an email to samplecopy@wrmea.org.
And we'll give that again a couple times during the interview, listeners. There's also a bookstore that you have, and you have a lot of materials that people can't find in bookstores or sometimes even online. You want to describe that and how people can access it?
Actually, and our bookstore is probably reaching more people than our magazine at this point. It's called Middle East Books and More, and it's in Adams Morgan, DC, 1902 18th Street. And it's right next to a Museum of the Palestinian People. A Palestinian-owned bakery is nearby, and a florist. We're calling this Little Palestine at this point, on 18th Street. And during this crisis, it's been a meeting point for people on the sidewalk. We've had fundraisers. People just come and vent because they're so upset about our U.S. foreign policy. Diplomats come in and vent about how they don't get a say anymore. It's just top-down foreign policy decisions. We've had ex-military people who served in Iraq vent. Everyone just comes here and starts to feel a little better because they're talking to like-minded people. The only people who don't come here are the media. We've never had a story about the magazine. It's just like verboten.
Well, as your father and the other diplomats intended, you developed your own media, and your father and the other diplomats you mentioned would go on small radio shows all over the country that weren't censoring the truth about what's going on in the Middle East and U.S. role there. And the bookstore has all kinds of materials that people can access. What are some of the materials that are there?
So every current book on Israel, Palestine, our foreign policy, and then we have sections on every country. We also have Palestinian pottery that's beautiful, comes from a store in Jerusalem. We have keffiyehs made in Hebron. A lady downstairs right now is selling embroidery from Janine. She's going to be here for 2 more days and then come back next week. And we're about to enlarge this bookstore so we can have more events, film screenings, book talks. We used to have them, but we're under construction now. Anyway, once we do, we will really be able to have larger events.
Now, to get a free copy, listeners, this is really an amazingly detailed magazine. It has so many articles, small articles, large articles, color pictures, and it has a special section inside where they reprint important articles from other media outlets, and that's why we're going to talk about the interview of the Gaza Undertaker very shortly. So, Delinda, very slowly, give the website where they can get the free copy of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs sent to them, and where they can, another website where they can access this bookstore.
Okay, good points. And on our website, you can find 40 plus years of all the articles we've ever printed, and that is really popular. The website is www.wrmea.org, and it stands for Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. And if you send an email to the sample copy at Wormia at wrmea.org, they can get a sample copy. So if they want to order anything, including pottery from Middle East Books and More, our online sales are just as big as our bricks and mortar sales. And that is middleeastbooks.org.
Now, the magazine, Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, is in print and also online?
Yes. Yeah. You can just have a digital subscription. To be honest, during this war, we've made our articles online almost immediately. We figure our print readers, our subscribers are different from the people who want to access news online only. So we're just making everything free, but we really value subscribers because that's our bread and butter.
Delinda, what are some of the headline articles in the last 2 or 3 issues, just to convey the breadth and depth of your coverage?
Well, the one about the Undertaker, we can talk about. Biden and Congress fund and arm Israel's genocide is in that issue. Why the U.S. continues to fail in the Arab world. Messages from Palestine. We have a lot of writers from We Are Not Numbers, and they're young people just telling the story from Gaza. And I mean, we spend a lot of time making sure their articles go out to the world. So lots of important articles, all right. And while most publications depend on advertising to last, we don't have much advertising. Only charities dare to advertise with us because if you're a lawyer or a, I don't know, insurance salesman, you get phone calls from our adversaries saying, that's an anti-Semitic magazine. Don't do that. You won't have our business. We have a real problem with advertising. And also, may I say, libraries, we are so happy to send free subscriptions to libraries, even because one library subscription reaches so many people. And we have an endowment especially for that. But libraries, they're afraid to have us on their shelves sometimes because they get complaints or they get it destroyed. Or, I mean, books and magazines are under threat in this country. And our magazine's been under threat in libraries for a while.
We're speaking with Delinda Hanley, executive editor, Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. The listeners should know, this magazine doesn't just cover politics and diplomacy and the wars over there. It talks about Arabic cuisine, talks about Palestinian music, it has historical articles, it has articles by academics expressing their opinion. It has writers from all countries, including Israel, and it's very much an educational publication, filling a big vacuum. Some people think if you fill that vacuum, you're partisan. Well, the magazine gives you material you can't get anywhere else. A while back, they printed the vile anti-Semitic, racist remarks against Palestinian Semites by high Israeli officials, people who are heads of political parties, ministers, prime ministers, verbatim, some of the most vile epithets that can be hurled against any ethnic group. One was by a head of a political party which referred to Palestinian newborns as snakes coming out to grow up and be hating us, and we should go after their mothers. I mean, this is really off the wall, but you don't see these things in the mainstream press. So let's go to the remarkable interview of this Undertaker. His name is Abu Jawad. He's 64 years old, and he was a farmer. He would get up and deal with his olive trees and produce olive oil. And then October 7th came, and the question was, who's going to bury all these dead civilians? And he volunteered, working 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. with 4 other displaced Palestinians, and they weren't being paid. It was something that he did, and he prayed and cried through the whole day. He said, I've buried about 10 times more people during this war than I did across my 27 years as an undertaker. The least was 30 people a day. The most was 800 people a day. Since October 7th, I've buried more than 17,000 people. End quote. That's in 2 cemeteries, to indicate how the vast undercount is in this genocidal war that Israel has inflicted on a defenseless population, as Gideon Levy once called the Palestinians of Gaza. And the official figure now is just under 38,000 throughout all of Gaza being killed by the Israeli military. He's buried 17,000 himself. I think the real figure is about at least 250,000 dead. Nobody could endure what they have endured day after day of bombardment, artillery, fires, attacks on every civilian infrastructure, from schools, mosques, apartments, houses, refugee camps, open-air markets, on the roads fleeing refugees, ambulances. They've damaged or destroyed 150 healthcare facilities, according to the World Health Organization. They've damaged or destroyed almost all the hospitals. There's no food, no medicine. The water's dirty. If they can get it, leads to diarrhea, which is a deadly affliction of little babies and children. And it just goes on and on. Infectious diseases, hepatitis A now spreading. Over 85% of the people without shelter. They've had to abandon their homes or had their homes destroyed. No ambulances, no fire trucks, no health care. And they're trying to say that out of the 2.3 million people blockaded, there's no place to flee. In Gaza, an area small enough to be described as twice the size of the District of Columbia, has only incurred 37,000 plus fatalities. Are we to believe that these Palestinians have skin made of steel and asbestos and they generate their own nutrition and intravenous medicines? So this is the cruelest end game where the Palestinians can't even have their dead counted. So tell us more about this article that you reprinted, Abu Jawad, Heartbreak daily as he buries the people killed by Israel. It's by Abu Bakr Abed.
So it was reprinted in our Other Voices section. And Abu Jawad, lives in Deir al-Bahla refugee camp in central Gaza. And he's lost 66 pounds. He can't sleep. The images I see are pure horror, and they won't leave my mind. He said he's buried 10 times more people, as Ralph said, than he did in 27 years as an undertaker. And that article was published in February. So how many more has he buried? So the Washington Post, believe it or not, says that 500,000 Gazans face catastrophic hunger. And today's Post has a picture of a malnourished Palestinian girl. And I just keep thinking how Americans rise up and help puppies and kitties who are malnourished and facing starvation. Why aren't we helping children? All aid organizations are calling for a ceasefire. Why aren't we saying, that's it, no more arms? There will be a ceasefire. And Save the Children estimates that more than 20,000 children are missing. And the children are lost, disappeared, detained, buried under the rubble, or in these mass graves. Around 4,000 are buried under the rubble, and an unknown number are in mass graves. At least 17,000 children are believed to be separated from their families, some of them whisked off by Israel and stuck in prisons. It's just unfathomable that we don't stop it, and we can. We're supplying the bombs doing this.
He has really heartbreaking observations. Here's one of his quotes. This is Abu Jawad. Quote, "We collected them in pieces, their bodies so riddled with holes, it was like Israeli snipers tried to use them for practice. Others were crushed like a boiled potato. Many had huge facial burns. We couldn't really tell one person's body from the other, but we did our best. We made one big, deep grave, probably 10 meters, which is 30 feet deep, and buried them together. Normally, we can write the name of the deceased on their shroud, and their loved ones can come pray for them. But for those 800 that he buried in one day, had no loved ones to visit them." End of quote. Those are the words of Abu Jawad. And as Delinda said, this article came out in February, and the bombing, sniping continues. And a lot of the bombs have special shrapnel dispersal engineering to injure and kill people from a wide radius when the bomb falls. Now, whatever the situation was on October 7th, which led to this massive genocide, the Palestinians have been attacked by air, sea, and land for decades. Their homes have been demolished. They've been bombed extensively, for example, in 2009, 2014 in Gaza, all over the West Bank. The colonials are being armed, and they're harassing, killing Palestinians there, emptying villages, all with U.S. aid, U.S. weaponry, U.S. diplomatic cover, and all with Joe Biden refusing. They simply say to Netanyahu, the American taxpayers are paying for thousands of these trucks loaded on the Egyptian border, ready to go in to Gaza with food, medicine, water, and other necessities. We're putting American flags on these trucks, and they're going in, Mr. Netanyahu. Just don't dare obstruct them, like your predecessors did when they blew up the USS Liberty ship in 1967 and incurred a U.S. cover-up of that attack on an ally by Israel. So, Delinda, has this article, which is really sort of the ultimate eyewitness account, been referred to, carried, or extended in any of the media that you know?
No, it hasn't. I mean, they are talking about how many people are probably buried under the rubble, but no, this eyewitness story has not been covered.
Well, this always leads to the question, what if the shoe was on the other foot? Can you imagine if the Palestinians were a technological, military, and economic superpower supported to the hilt by the U.S. and dominating Israel, occupying it, seizing land, water, demolishing homes, seizing Israelis without due process, throwing them into prisons, and then the Israelis fought back. let's say they attacked on one night because this superpower let its military border defenses, the most advanced in the world, break down on a day. And they attacked and they killed 1,200 Palestinians. And the Palestinians did to the Israelis what the Israelis are now doing to the Palestinians. The U.S. would have its Marines everywhere, its Navy, its Air Force. You couldn't tell the difference between the Israeli military and the U.S. So this is the double standard, listeners, that's going on here. Palestinian life is just not worth much in the eyes of Joe Biden. He's not even opening up U.S. hospitals to bring the amputees and the seriously ill from Gaza over, just as a minimal humanitarian gesture, as we've done with some other beleaguered countries. What would you like to say to our listeners in terms of Congress and the White House, Delinda?
I would like to say stop aid to Israel. Just stop the carnage and stop this well-funded Israel government operation to tell us that student protesters are anti-Semitic, human rights organizations are anti-Semitic. Every voice of dissent is anti-Semitic, and they're conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. We just need carnage to end.
And in addition, AIPAC, the Israeli government can do no wrong lobby here, poured over $14 million to defeat Jamal Bowman, the Democrat from the Bronx in Westchester County, just this week in the primary. And it came down to $17,000 an hour they were spending on blanket ads and other media against this super progressive member of Congress who dared a few weeks after October 7th to call for a permanent ceasefire and describe what Netanyahu was doing as genocide. Two observations that were expressed by people all over the world, including international agencies. So the impact of this problem in the Middle East, listeners, is affecting American democracy, censoring people at universities, colleges, high schools, expelling them, canceling their events, and turning Congress into a total anti-Semitic toady against the Semitic Arabs of Palestine, rubber stamping endless billions of dollars. Imagine there are 15 million kids in this country who go hungry at night. We need more money for solid nutritional programs. We need money for neonatal care. We need money for affordable housing. And Congress just passed a $26 billion additional bundle of U.S. taxpayer cash to go to the Israeli military. Some of it presumably for humanitarian aid, but who's going to implement that? It's not clear. Is it going to be USAID from Washington, or is it going to be the Israeli military machine? And where is it going to go, and how's it going to be delivered? So let's turn to Steve and David and Hannah for input. Delinda.
Delinda, you talked about your father and the other diplomats who thought everything was too top down. Can you elaborate a little bit about what you mean about that? Because I think it underscores how we as citizens get information.
Well, I think it's gotten worse since they started the magazine, to be honest. Diplomats used to be able to say, write telegrams and make proposals that people might have read in Washington. But now in President Biden's administration and all the recent administrations, diplomats don't have a say. One diplomat came into the bookstore last week and said, "We're just pushing papers. We don't get to talk about policy. No one's listening to us. Our recommendations just don't go anywhere." And we have seen some people, quitting, and a lot of people want to quit. This is not the way to run foreign policy with a small group of advisors and a president.
So their expertise is being ignored.
Totally, yeah. And it's getting worse. At least in those days, you could write a telegram or something and people would read it.
David?
The United Democracy Project seems to be the super PAC that is the front for AIPAC. They're pumping all that money into the defeat of Jamal Bowman. They targeted Summer Lee 2 years ago in Pittsburgh, Jessica Cisneros down in Texas. And they also donated to nearly 100 Republicans who refused to certify the election for Joe Biden. What are the laws regarding super PACs that are front organizations for foreign countries?
That is a good question. There should be laws. It's almost espionage. People should be embarrassed to take this money, but they act like it's from US citizens and they just get away with it. And I should also add, in our last issue, we have a list of all the pro-Israel PAC donations in the 2024 elections, how much money every congressperson has taken in. And a lot of it is not listed because it is in these, they donate to these super PACs. And these super PACs pay for ads that never mention Israel, even though they're funded by AIPAC. They're AIPAC funded PACs. They don't mention Israel. They come up with anything else.
Well, AIPAC has been described as basically a foreign agent
Yes.
of the Israeli government and should register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act that's been on the books in the federal statutes for years. And there have been law professors and practitioners and experts who have urged the Justice Department to enforce that law, but to no avail whatsoever. Hannah?
Mainstream media coverage of the genocide in Palestine seems to prioritize simplifying things so that the readers can understand. But anyone who's lived through any experience knows that there's nuance, things are complicated. And outlets like the Times and the Post really seem to be making hard work of covering any current event related to Palestine or Israel. But looking at just the table of contents for your latest edition, you seem to make easy work of covering all of the complexities of the issue. So could you speak to how you find contributors and the editorial approach that you all take?
Thank you. That's a good question. And we have correspondents around the world, really. And as I said, these Gazan writers now from We Are Not Numbers. We have correspondents who focus on different parts of the world. And then we also, in the other voices section that took that Undertaker's story, we just find the best from the internet too. And Al Jazeera, which is pretty much illegal here in the US, people are publishing wonderful articles. Counterpunch, Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, and lots of different articles. We can get them from all over, reprint them, or ask specialists to write articles for us too.
Including Israelis and from Israeli newspapers.
Yes, absolutely. Gideon Levy is a favorite of our readers from Haaretz. And we also have a conference. We used to have a conference every year. We skipped it last year, focusing on AIPAC. We get so many of these fabulous writers like Gideon Levy to come and talk about AIPAC and Israel. And we missed it this year because of the war on Gaza. It's just overwhelming everyone. That's
Gideon Levy, by the way, is a longtime columnist, tremendously courageous for the Haaretz newspaper, a very well-regarded independent newspaper in Israel. Delinda Hanley, can you read the last part of the interview with Abu Jawad, the Undertaker in Gaza?
Yes, I'd be honored to. For me, those killed are still alive, and we are the dead, because we're dying slowly. There is no means of life here, no water, no food, no electricity, no peace, nothing at all. Is this a life? Nearly every day I see someone who doesn't leave their beloved's grave. I leave and come back just to see them still sobbing for their deep loss. For a family to bring their dead to the cemetery is not an easy task. There have been numerous reports of people burying their dead in their yards because they could not venture out into the street with the body. It takes days, weeks, for a family to bring in their loved ones to the cemetery. Sometimes it's because there are no tools to get bodies out of the rubble of a destroyed house. Sometimes it's because they can't find shrouds or anything else to wrap the bodies in. I've buried 67 of my family. The hardest was my cousins, who I was very close to. Their bodies were destroyed. They were in pieces. I didn't recognize any of them. Despite the scale of loss and horror I see every day, I can't stop, and I never will. Stop this genocide. We want a peaceful life. I want to leave and go home safely every day, not battling starvation and war at the same time.
End quote. Those are the words of 64-year-old Abu Jawad, who is the lead undertaker for 2 cemeteries in Gaza and the mass graves that he has to put pieces of bodies in every day. Thank you very much, Delinda. Before we end, please give your websites, both of them, slowly for our listeners so they can get more information.
Yes, I'd be pleased to. Thank you for inviting me, and please ask for a sample copy. So our website is www.wrmea.org, and our bookstore website is www.middleeastbooks.com.
Thank you. We've been speaking with Delinda Hanley, executive editor of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, the magazine that's been around for many years, giving you the truth, the facts, and the scenes in the Arab Middle East and our foreign policy impact on that region. Thank you very much, Delinda.
Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Delinda Hanley. We will link to the Washington Report for Middle East Affairs at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson returns to give us his take on the true state of the United States military. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, June 28, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The monetary penalties imposed in major corporate crime cases are consistently discounted below the low end of the fine range calculated pursuant to the organizational sentencing guidelines, sometimes even below the monetary benefits company received from the wrongdoing. That's the finding of a recent paper titled DPA Discounts by Todd Hall and Mason McCartney. The paper finds that the culpability score calculations made pursuant to the guidelines, which are designed to calibrate a company's ultimate penalty with its level of wrongdoing, are not statistically significant in determining penalties. Instead, it appears a norm has developed at the Department of Justice giving an almost uniform 25% discount off the low end of the fine range, regardless of a company's culpability, they write. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scroven, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and the rest of the team, which includes, of course, Ralph. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson has some rather strong feelings about the institution that he has devoted his life to. David?
Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired U.S. Army colonel. Over his 31 years of service, Colonel Wilkerson served as Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff. That was from 2002 to 2005. He was also Special Assistant to General Powell when Powell was Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 1989 to 1993. Colonel Wilkerson also served as Deputy Director and Director of the U.S. Marine Corps War College at Quantico, Virginia, and for 15 years he was the Distinguished Visiting Professor of Government and Public Policy at the College of William and Mary. He is currently a Senior Fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network, Senior Advisor to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and co-founder of the All-Volunteer Force Forum. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And you might add, David, he's a leading advocate against militarism, the military-industrial complex, and an advocate of waging peace in the world. Larry, we're now in a situation that's very dangerous over in Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, and elsewhere. It looks like the Biden regime doesn't have a policy, either to impose a permanent ceasefire, put American flags on all these trucks that are lined up to save lives in the starving population of Gaza, lined up and obstructed by Israeli military day after day, and to get this conflict resolved. Instead, Biden seems to be, with his Secretary of Defense Austin and his Secretary of State Blinken, coddling the Israeli Defense Minister and Prime Minister Netanyahu instead of demanding that they adhere to policies in the interest of peace in the Middle East and American interests overseas. What's your take on this?
Not very much different from the one you just outlined. And Bibi coming to the United States is a macabre joke. The very idea that he is going to be allowed to come into the house of the people of the United States. That's what these people forget. These senators and these representatives and the executive branch, that's our house. And Bibi Netanyahu coming to that house is a defilement of it. He's a war criminal.
You're talking about the invitation that both party leaders in the Congress tendered to Netanyahu, which he's accepted, to come on
Absolutely.
July 24th and speak to a joint session of Congress inside the House of Representatives, just to be clear.
And Mark Pocan, a brave Democrat, I hope he means it, and I hope he goes ahead and carries it out, has offered to serve the summons to Netanyahu. He walks through the door, the summons from the International Criminal Court. That's what Bibi deserves.
Well, the other point is, what is the opposition going to do on that day, July 24th? They're going to obviously demonstrate big time outside the Congress and be pushed back further and further. But there needs to be an alternative committee hearing at the same time. And, you know, members of Congress can get their own committee and have witnesses like yourself and other prominent people provide a counterpoint. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that'd be a great idea. I suggested in New York City 2 weeks ago when I was there at a book event, and the New Yorkers that were there were very eager to do exactly what I suggested, and I challenged them to do it. Get together a march like Martin Luther King had, 1 million person, a 2 million, a 5 million person march, come down to Washington, surround that house, and forbid this war criminal to come in it. It's your house, people. He should not be allowed on the grounds, let alone in the joint session of Congress, during which, if his previous occurrence when he was here doing the same thing is any example, he'll criticize the sitting president of the United States from our house, from our Congress. This is just, like I said, it's a macabre joke, but it's real.
Well, it shrinks even further the ink blot that we call Congress, to use a word by Bruce Fein. And it raises a question. There are a lot of retired military who know what the score is. They know what has to be done to turn this country into a peacemaker. You know a lot of these people. You've networked with them. Are they becoming more active given all the provocations in the kind of solid phalanx that Biden and company has established with the most extreme right-wing Israeli regime, the genocidal regime in Gaza, headed by Netanyahu, despised by 3 out of 4 Israelis, and already under indictment in Israel by Israeli prosecutors for domestic corruption? What are the retired people doing here?
Well, there are a lot of people that are anxious to do something, but they're conflicted, and I understand their confliction because at the same time we have this idiocy, this insanity in Ukraine and in Gaza. We have a fairly substantial strategic risk in another place called China. And though I don't advocate for a war with China, I certainly advocate, as do they, most of them, flag officers or whatever they might be, they advocate for at least the capability to fulfill the bellicose rhetoric coming out of the White House without going to resort to nuclear weapons, which I think is the White House's ultimate strategy. Because we know, all of us know, that the armed forces of the United States are broken. They are broken from years and years of the all-volunteer force, years and years of war, years and years of stupid, idiotic war with no purpose, years and years of wounds, PTSD, suicides, just off the charts now. And the armed forces are not doing well. And yet we've got a president talking like, when we finish with Russia through a proxy war, bleeding the hell out of Ukraine to accomplish it, we're going to go after China. And oh, by the way, we're going to put some people in Taiwan to make sure that the Taiwanese think we're going to do it. And Beijing is going to see the red line being crossed and we're going to go to war. Well, I got news for them. Eisenhower coming out of the Red Sea after 9 months of deployment is just the tip of the iceberg. We are broken. Our armed forces are broken. The reserve components are broken. They were 33 to 40% short on their recruiting. Ralph, they're breveting officers now. They're breveting officers from captain to major and lieutenant colonel. They're calling active duty lieutenant colonels out of the already short active force and putting them in command of reserve battalions because they don't have reserve lieutenant colonels to do it. We couldn't mobilize if we tried. So I have to assume if Austin is telling the president, if C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is telling the president the truth about the state of the armed forces of the United States, or even half the truth, that all we're depending on is our nuclear weapons.
Tell us about the bonuses they're offering recruits.
Well, the bonuses are inconsequential now because they can't get them. The propensity to serve in the United States is 9%, as low as it's ever been since polling started. That's the 18 to 24-year-old age group. Not only that, the demographic of 5 to 10-year-olds coming up behind them to replace them is about 15% shorter than the demographic currently in existence. We couldn't field a military without a wholesale draft if we tried to. And implementing a draft, and drafting women too, is going to be a political nightmare. And we haven't even started the process of doing it. So we've got a lot of people in the military, retired and active duty, understand how unready we are right now, and yet they see the rhetoric that's going on with respect to China and with respect to Russia. And Russia and China together, forget it. There's no way. We'd have to resort to nuclear weapons. And that frightens me because I know we would.
We would resort to nuclear weapons?
Absolutely. Who was the last country in the world to use nuclear weapons?
Well, this is pretty shocking coming from someone who's been inside government for years, including the State Department. What do you see Zelensky doing? He seems to be pulling Biden deeper and deeper. First, Biden didn't want advanced missiles, and he finally said yes. He didn't want F-16s, and he finally said yes to Zelensky. He didn't want U.S. arms to go beyond the border in Russia, and he said, okay, you can go on beyond the border. Now Zelensky wants U.S. weapons to bomb Russian bases deep into Russia. What's going on here? Why is he so successful in getting Biden to change his mind?
You got me there. Russia has won. There's some really clear facts right now about Ukraine. Russia has won. Russia has no designs on NATO, none whatsoever. But Putin is right when he says NATO has designs on Russia. It's downhill for NATO from this point on. There's no question about it. And the hill just might be a cliff. The new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, outgoing Dutch Foreign Minister, I believe, doesn't take over until October. That's probably going to be too late. And I don't know that he's going to be a fresh face, but Jens Stoltenberg needs to go. He needs to get out of there. He thinks he's some kind of alternative SACEUR, talking about using nuclear weapons even.
He's the director of NATO.
Yes, Jens Stoltenberg's the Secretary General of NATO, and Mark Rutte is going to replace him in October. But that's late. I hear Rutte is not quite the war-mongering nut that Jens Stoltenberg is, who is our guy, of course. We put him in there. But I don't know that. And October is going to be really late because, as I said, what we need is what you intimated at the beginning. We need a ceasefire, and we need to sit down and talk and come up with a peace agreement. Putin has been very prudent, very pragmatic, very clear, very clear. He prefaces almost every press conference with, this is not about territory, it's about security, my security, Russia's security. That's what I'm talking about. Therefore, Ukraine cannot possibly be a member of NATO, and Ukraine has to give up some of the things that I've taken with my blood. Well, that's what we're going to have to do. And if you have to get rid of Zelensky to do it, get rid of him. But we do not need to be in this conflict just for the CEOs of Lockheed Martin and other defense contractors.
What's so troubling, Larry, is we have no Department of Peace. It's all weaponry. It's all war. Biden never saw a war he didn't like that the U.S. empire provoked or was involved in. The State Department acts like the War Department when its charter requires diplomacy, which means peace negotiations.
When the Pentagon conducted this heinous regime of propaganda in the Philippines to get them not to buy the Chinese COVID vaccine, they didn't even clear it with the State Department. And apparently the executive branch said that was all right. That's okay. You don't have to clear this sort of clearly influencing our foreign policy move. You don't have to clear it with the State Department. That's the last straw. That means the Pentagon's in charge of almost everything that counts for this country now. I saw this happening when I was chief of staff. Powell fought it hard. They wanted to take over IMED. international military educating and training money. They wanted state no longer to pick the countries to whom that money went. They wanted the Pentagon to pick it. That's what's been happening. States' powers have been eroded majorly and handed to the Pentagon. You might as well say the Pentagon runs America.
Well, what do you think the Trump administration would be like in terms of Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, China?
Well, they're the ones that turn this power over to the Defense Department. I don't know that they would be any better. They couldn't hardly be worse, but I don't know that they'd be any better. And domestically, I think they'd be a lot worse. I'm not looking forward to a Trump second term.
Well, I hope these alert retired high officers who are part of your network will mobilize even more. I know you're part of the Veterans for Peace. They've been doing very great work, putting out good material, testifying, demonstrating, protesting. They have 100 chapters around the country. Anybody can join, by the way. You just go to veteransforpeace.org. But we're looking for some of these recent retirees from the high echelons who have a better, more peaceful take about this, as well as a sense of the horrors of nuclear war. And I hope that they'll be organized with you to make more of an impact in the coming months. Any chance of more visibility for them in the media?
Most of the ones that I know and that I trust and have some respect for are either so old they can't hardly move, more or less like me, or they're dead. Ralph, 26 out of 32 flag officers at the 3- and 4-star rank went to defense contractors last year. 26 out of 32. That's what most of these flag officers want these days, is to just get out of there and get a $500,000 plus annual salary, or even more than that with stock options and such. So you don't have any real flag officer leadership in the armed forces of the United States today. Not really.
Well, we're running short of time, but we want to get Steve and company to pitch in here. Steve?
Colonel Wilkerson, elaborate more on our preparedness as a military, because we always, every 4 years, you hear how this president claims that I've rebuilt the military. And it seems like every 4 years, it, according to them, goes down the drain, and then it's got to be rebuilt again. Speak to that, because you just said that we are really not prepared, when it seems to me we spend all of this money.
It's a whole series of lies, and it starts with the money. The Congress even pluses up the president's budget request for the National Defense Authorization Act. More money is spent than the next 10 countries below us spend in combination. But that's not what makes your military ready and able to fight. What makes it ready and able to fight is that money goes to good purposes. That money's not going to good purposes. It's going to buy things like a $400 million aircraft that has an operationally ready rate of about 50%. Wait until they put that Marine baby flat top in the Red Sea with F-35s on it, and they take off and challenge the Houthis, and the Houthis with a $175,000 drone shoot one of them down. That'll be the wake-up call, if it'll even fly. So we have polluted the Pentagon with so much money that they can't even pass an audit. They couldn't if they tried for the next 10 years, and they don't know how to spend their money. And the way they spend their money is basically on two things. They spend it on paying allowances for the extraordinarily expensive all-volunteer force and the bonuses and other things that go with it, and they spend it on defense contractors. That doesn't leave a lot left for things like ships. We're down to 277. We're down to 11 aircraft carriers, and the next one doesn't go on the ways for building until 2027, costs $16 billion and won't come out for 10 years, and the cost overruns will make it $20 billion, and it won't come out for 20 years. Submarines the same way, the most potent weapons we have, we're letting them go to hell. We don't have a ship workforce anymore. We don't have shipyards anymore. We are broken, and yet we're yelling at the world about all the things we're going to do to them if they don't follow our steps.
Well, it seems what you're talking about is a arms control movement. What do you need 10 aircraft carriers for? They're sitting ducks now. They're obsolete, nothing usable except for force projection of the empire. So I don't understand, Leader, why you talk about readiness. The readiness is for provocations and wars that we provoke out of the empire.
You're missing my point, Ralph. They are not spending the money for the right things. They are not spending the money, which is copious and bountiful, for the right things, whether it's aircraft carriers or what. If it were me, I'd be spending the money, and I told General Powell this when he wanted to cut the submarine force at the end of the Cold War. I'd be spending the money on submarines. Bang for the buck, submarines are the best weapon system on the face of this earth. They are still undetectable. They are still virtually invulnerable. And just our boomer submarines carry enough nuclear warheads to exterminate the world. So do the Soviets. So if I were going to spend money on something, I would spend it on something that counts, not the bullshit that we spend it on now.
But you would favor a much reduced military budget, I think.
Absolutely. I could cut $100 billion every year for the next 10 years, total of $1 trillion, out of the DOD budget if you let me do the acquisition and you let me do the planning, and I'd make a much better military than what we have today.
David?
The Israeli Supreme Court just ruled that ultra-Orthodox Jews now have to serve in the military.
Hooray, hooray, hooray.
Yeah.
I cheer that.
Yep. Zelensky in Ukraine is plagued by an epidemic of draft dodgers, at least according to the New York Times. You say bringing back the draft in America is a third rail politically. Would this global war on terror last longer than 20 years? Would this be a war economy if we bit the bullet and brought back the draft?
It's an interesting question. It has a lot of dimensions to it. And the first dimension is what CBO just produced about a week ago. I don't know if you saw Malden's piece on it and Bloomberg's. By 2034, we're going to be $50.7 trillion in debt. The interest payments on that debt, which interestingly, this year will be $1 trillion, the equivalent of the defense budget and some. By that time, by 2034, that's not very far away. It's going to be Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and the defense budget equivalent. We are flat broke and just waiting for the lack of confidence that the American people need to register to have another great recession, if not worse. So in terms of just the biggest problem confronting this country right now, by far and away, besides the climate crisis and nuclear weapons with no treaties, by far and away, it's our fiscal state. We are broken physically, and no one wants to admit it nor do anything about it. Not Janet Yellen, not the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. No one wants to recognize it. They all hope they get out before the crash comes.
I take it you want to restore the Trump tax cuts and then some on the super wealthy and the big corporations that are under tax.
Yeah, I'd love to tax the hell out of everyone that makes over $1 million a year. I'd love to tax them to 90%, like we did all during World War II and all during the 8 years of the Eisenhower administration. 90%.
How do we pay off the debt if we don't allow these migrants into the country? We have a population implosion that nobody's talking about.
Yeah, that's part of the problem too. This piece that Malden wrote is just it just rocks you on your heels. I think he's right. The CBO has been low. For the last decade, the CBO has been low on its estimates, saying that the debt will grow by $2 trillion a year, 1.8 trillion, whatever. The debt has outstripped their predictions, and he's of a mind, and I think he's right, that it will outstrip their predictions now. So it won't be 2034. It might be 2030 that we have $57 trillion of aggregate debt.
The CBO is the Congressional Budget Office, listeners.
Yeah.
Anna?
First, I just want to say I'm tempted to write in Lawrence B. Wilkerson in November.
Amen.
I'm on board with all these policies. Quickly, as we approach Independence Day, and we're going to be surrounded by all sorts of grossly militaristic performative patriotism, what would your ideal 4th of July be? Your answer could also be absolutely nothing, would be a fair answer.
Mine is going to be what I want it to be, which is, and I thank the Community Church of Boston for this, I'm going to give their annual 4th of July address on John Kennedy's speech at American University in the summer of 1963. And I wrote the text 2 nights ago, and I was rehearsing it yesterday. And as I was telling one of my friends, I couldn't hardly get the rehearsal over because tears were in my eyes by the time I got to it. Because I was quoting that speech where he asked for world disarmament, where he asked for world peace. And he says, not the peace of the dead, not the peace of the grave, not the peace of the slave, but the peace that every human being should want and should have. And by the way, in order to do that, I'm going to make an opening to the Soviet Union, and I'm going to make peace ultimately with the Soviet Union. And we're going to start with a comprehensive test. That's why they shot him. That's why 5 months later in Dallas, they shot him. Former government and government officials conspired and shot him. That's my 4th of July.
Well, on that note, looking forward to your speech in Boston. That's a historic venue in that church, Larry, and I hope it gets some media attention. We've been talking with Larry Wilkerson, retired colonel, a lot of years in government, and now he's become a vigorous champion of peace and a critic of the military-industrial complex in the U.S. empire from a very deep base of knowledge. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thanks for having me, Ralph.
I want to thank our guests again, Delinda Hanley and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, you can get it for free by going to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And guess what, folks? The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak with Washington Post reporter Shannon Osaka about the microplastics we breathe. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Remember, you can get a free copy of the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs by just going to that website that Delinda gave earlier.
Rise up, I know you ought to rise up.